Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 308, The Sedentary Sultan. Murad III was 20 years older than any rival to the claimant at the death of Selim II. Hence, there was really no question as to who would succeed the deceased Selim. Murad, soon to be Murad III, moved quickly to remove even the perception of any threat. Upon receiving news of his father's death, Murad ordered the execution of his younger brothers, who were buried together alongside their father Selim. This wasn't easy for Murad. Consider the following first-hand account of the murders. Quote, "But the Sultan Murat, who was so compassionate as to be unable to see bloodshed, waited 18 hours, in which he refused to sit on the imperial throne or to make public his arrival in the city, seeking and discussing a way first to free his 9 brothers of the blood who were in the Segregario, in order that he should not break the law of the Ottoman state. Weeping, he sent the mutes to strangle them, giving 9 handkerchiefs with his own hands to the chief of the mutes." End quote. Unfortunately, the death of all the heirs spares was Ottoman state policy and law. Murad's successor, Mehmed III, would do the same in 1595. The prince's death was the price of a smooth succession. Mehmed Pasha continued as Grand Vizier until 1579, when he was assassinated by a disgruntled petitioner. He was truly the last great Grand Vizier. After Pasha, 7 men held the position for the remaining 21 years of Murad's reign. It's interesting because from this point on, the Grand Vizier becomes a puppet who could be and frequently was replaced at the Sultan's whim. The Grand Vizier still made a lot of bureaucratic decisions on a day-to-day basis, but his authority over larger matters was decisively curtailed. Daily conversations between the Vizier and the Sultan were replaced with correspondence, in which the Sultan more or less dictated his decisions to the Vizier. More than even Selim II, Murad preferred to pass his days in his private chambers rather than his council chamber. He was, as a result, much more susceptible to the influence of favorites. While he lived, Mehmed Pasha was able to keep the fractions around the Sultan at bay. But once he died, the boiler truly burst. One of these factions was led by Murad's mother, Nurbanu. Starting with the reign of Suleiman, the women of the royal house had played an increasingly important role in public life, and this was definitely true during Murad's reign, and definitely true of Nurbanu. She dominated her son until her death, roughly 10 years into his reign. Foreign envoys knew how important it was to gain her favor. A visitor from Istanbul in 1582 remarked, quote, "The wife with the queen mother governed everything. One had to depend on them, or at least not have them against you." End quote. It was long believed that Nurbanu was actually Venetian, in fact, but in reality she was Greek from the island of Corfu. With Murad, the royal household became still more of a royal family. On his ascension, he moved his household to Istanbul from Manisa, where, as Prince Governor, he had lived with his consort and their children. In Istanbul, Nurbanu made her place again beside her son, moving into the harem at Topkapı Palace from the old palace, where she had retired on Selim's death. As queen mother, she saw to the smooth functioning of the harem and stood at the peak of its hierarchy. Her daily stipend was the highest in the empire, 3 times that of the Sultan himself. Nurbanu's Sultan transfer of residency from the old to the new palace was celebrated, in fact, with a public procession throughout Istanbul. Within 10 years of Murad's ascension, the number of women in the harem had doubled to more than 100. The harem quarters were rebuilt to provide more splendid apartments for the Sultan's mother, extra space for the growing number of women housed there. For himself, Murad built a 2-story domed bedroom pavilion, inner walls clad with the finest tiles, and to this he added baths and a domed room next to his bedchamber. All of this was essentially showing that this would be a sultan not to leave the capital. Unlike Selim II, Murad essentially lived with his harem. He did not maintain his own totally separate residency, as had been customary before. While Murad was largely monogamous for the purpose of succession throughout much of his reign, later on he took a series of concubines and died, leaving 49 children. While this might seem unimportant at first blush, all these details, this is a real change in how sultans behaved. Previously, sultans had been moving targets. They had always gone on campaigns with their armies. The goal was military expansion. After the death of Suleiman, and certainly after the death of Selim II, this is no longer the case. The Sultan remained sedentary, and the armies increasingly stayed at home. Parallel to the rise of the harem as a critical government institution under Murad was the rise of his male favorites. Murad, by and large, promoted the interests of those who had been close to him in his formative years. Probably the most interesting of these was Shaykh Suka, an uneducated religious mystic to whom Murad had been close to for years before his ascension. The Sultan relied on Suka to interpret his dreams and forecast his destiny. This wasn't totally unusual. Sunni Islam had long had a mystical aspect to it at this point. What was unusual was the extent to which the mystic was able to wield political power within the council. Again, what we're seeing here is less of an emphasis on what we might call military matters and more on domestic policy, which is a major change for the Ottoman state. But of course, the Ottomans still had a first-class military, perhaps the best in all of Europe, and they intended to use it. Murad continued Selim II's aggressive policies in North Africa and to an extent in the Western Mediterranean. Morocco quickly became an Ottoman satellite. In 1578, Portugal and Spain, Philip's support was half-hearted at best, attacked Morocco, but the Ottomans were ultimately able to keep their puppet royal family in control of the region. In 1580, Murad and Philip of Spain signed a peace treaty bringing to an end what had been a half-century-long conflict in the Western Mediterranean. Critically, this freed up both sides to focus on issues closer to home and which were both prioritized by most states. Meanwhile, the Ottomans made two last efforts to break Portuguese power in the Indian Ocean, one in 1585 and another in 1589. But it was clear by this point that Portuguese naval superiority was going to win out. And so in yet another region, Ottoman power was clearly on the decline. But the biggest military conflict of Murad's reign was in the east. We tend to think of the Ottomans only when they impacted affairs in Western Europe. But it's worth remembering that, to a large extent, the Ottoman Empire faced the other direction. In 1578, war broke out again between the Ottomans and the Iranians. The dispute this time was over the Caucasus Mountains and the regions which surrounded them. This was a long war that lasted until 1639. It was, in many ways, a legacy of Mehmed Pasha. He believed a firm Ottoman presence in the Caucasus was needed to check the growth of Muscovite power south. Iran was relatively incidental, but needed to be pushed out so that the Ottoman state could create a buffer. The war would be left, though, to another senior official, Lala Mustafa. As the Caucasus was the theater of war, the eastern Anatolian frontier city of Erzurum was the forward base for the Ottoman campaign against Iran. Having sailed to Trebizond and then marched south over the mountains, Lala Mustafa and his army mobilized at Erzurum during the summer of 1578. The Safavids and their client states in the Caucasus were in so much disarray and confusion that the Ottomans were able to advance through Georgia and occupying Tiflis, which is actually the capital of modern Georgia, as they went to reach the principalities all the way to the north. By the summer, several of the princes of the regions had already submitted to the Ottomans, who now occupied parts of the Shivran area on the western shore of the Caspian. Unfortunately, Lala Mustafa was recalled due to a series of palace intrigues, which are simply too confusing to go through here, and he was ultimately appointed the second vizier after Mehmed Pasha was assassinated in 1579. Mustafa did not reap many rewards from this posting, however. He died in 1580. Over the next several years, a series of Ottoman officials did their best to consolidate Ottoman control over, generally speaking, what is today Georgia. However, the task there was difficult for much the same reasons that it had been in Yemen. Local power was volatile and the terrain difficult. By the end of the 16th century, the character of warfare was changing in both the East and the West. Previously, particularly in Iran, the ability of the enemy to avoid a pitched battle by simply disappearing into the countryside had often prevented Ottoman efforts to attain a decisive victory. But the recent campaigns on that front demonstrated that a more what we would call static style of warfare was becoming the norm, involving fortresses that had to be reduced by lengthy sieges if territory was to be won and held. On the Habsburg-Ottoman border, after the Truce of 1568, the Habsburgs and their allies took refuge behind essentially a forward line of strongholds intended to protect the interior from enemy incursions, and these had their counterparts on the Ottoman side of the frontier. In 1593, war broke out between the Holy Roman Empire, really Austria at this point, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, and this is another one of those lengthy wars that would last until 1606. The gains and losses enjoyed and suffered by the Ottomans, Habsburgs, and Hungarians alike over the 13 years of this war illustrated just how wearying this sort of warfare was, and generally speaking, how inconclusive it has become. The first 2 years achieved absolutely nothing on either side. Early in 1595, the Sultan died and was smoothly succeeded by his 29-year-old son, Mehmed III. Fortunately, he inherited a state that was, generally speaking, in disarray, and it was clear that a new strategy was needed to raise the prestige of both the Sultan and the empire. At a meeting convened by the new Grand Vizier, it was agreed that, in what was a radical departure from recent practice, the new Sultan, even though he was totally inexperienced, would lead the army in battle, something that no Sultan had done since Suleiman's final campaign in 1566. In June of 1596, the Ottoman Imperial Army set out to join the forces which had been holding the line on the frontier. Their aim was to capture a fortress called Eger, which lay on the route between Austria and Transylvania, and which, together with the client states of Moldavia and Wallachia, had sought Habsburg protection. Eger fell, and the Ottoman army, with its Tartar reinforcements, then encountered the Transylvanians and the main Habsburg army on a nearby plain on the 25th of October. From closely contested field battle which ensued, the only actual field battle of the entire war, the Ottomans emerged victorious. At first it seemed that they had lost, and only the fierce attack on the Habsburg forces as they plundered the Ottoman camp turned the day. The Sultan, though, not relishing his role as commander-in-chief, had suggested to his new Grand Vizier that he should return to Istanbul. The following years saw fortresses and towns change hands as vassal states, such as Wallachia and Transylvania, repeatedly switched sides. Ultimately exhausted, the two main powers, the Habsburgs and the Ottomans, finally agreed to a peace treaty in 1605, which was signed in 1606. The Ottomans got some meager, and I do mean really meager, territorial gains, and the Holy Roman Emperor got recognition as an equal. Basically, this meant that the emperor could finally stop paying yearly tribute to the Sultan, which was crucial to the balance of power in the region, as the Ottomans could no longer use their enemies' money to fight them. Domestically, the last quarter of the 16th century was a difficult time for the Ottoman state, as it was for many warring European states. Up to this point, the various Ottoman conquests had essentially driven economic growth. But after roughly 1570, those days were over. As a result, to pay for the war with Iran and everybody else, the Sultan began a policy of debasing the silver coinage. The problem is that those on fixed salaries, bureaucrats, and military officials in particular, now effectively had their salaries cut in half. The debased coins could no longer buy as much. This was a European-wide problem, really, that was just worse in the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't bad or great everywhere else. It was just terrible for the Ottomans. In Western Europe, even if no one debased the coinage, the influx of silver from the Americas still brought down the value of existing coins. Hence, this was a period, in general, of widespread inflation. It was just worse in the Ottoman Empire. Moreover, by debasing the coinage, that meant the tax income to Istanbul went down. To make up the difference, the Sultan issued new taxes and borrowed money from wealthy individuals within the empire. Note, the Ottoman state did not raise foreign loans until actually the 19th century. And of course, debasement of the coinage led to yet another Janissary revolt, forcing Murad to sacrifice the local officials that these elite soldiers blamed for their financial losses. This was also a new development in the Ottoman state. The consistent scapegoating of financial troubles on other people within the government. Making matters worse, the two most important elite corps, the Janissaries and the palace cavalry, often supported different palace factions, so whoever was in ascendant kept their favorites safe. Those in decline watched as their palace contacts lost their heads. Oftentimes, this factional violence played itself out in the streets of Istanbul as well. The financial and social distress that accompanied the debasement of the coinage came at a time when the costs of warfare had reached unprecedented levels as fighting methods had now changed. The provincial cavalry forces, supported by agricultural taxes paid in lieu of an obligation to appear on campaign, were just not as effective anymore in an age of defensive, siege-based warfare. And as the borders of empire expanded, provincial cavalrymen lost their enthusiasm for campaigning. They had scarcely recovered from the exhausting Iranian War that lasted from 1578 to 1590, when their services were once again required on the Habsburg frontier and then back again on the Iranian one. As one palace official would write in 1597, these cavalrymen had not seen peace for 20 years. Infantry, which, when we're talking about the Ottoman army, really just means the musket-bearing Janissaries, were more useful than cavalry in modern warfare, and their numbers grew as a result, from around 8,000 in 1527 to 13,500 by the time of the Sultan Selim II's death in 1574, and to almost 40,000 by 1609. Like other salaried state employees, whose numbers also grew, they had to be paid in cash, and on time, by the way, if you wanted to avert a rebellion or trouble. The government was now in a dilemma. The rapid increase in the numbers of salaried troops couldn't continue indefinitely, and so it reached out for other sources of manpower. A solution which appealed because it was cheap was to just enlist men from the peasantry, the prime requirement now being Muslims who could wield a musket, and these men would serve for the term of a campaign, after which time they would be demobilized. This innovation openly flouted the fiction the peasants were disbarred from serving in the combat army, being only employed to perform various auxiliary tasks alongside the elite fighting troops and the provincial cavalry. It soon became clear, though, that even if they had not been troublemakers prior to enlistment, men already disaffected by overtaxation and their inability to make ends meet became a major disruptive element after demobilization. They retained their guns and did not return to their previous occupations. The allegiance of these men could often be bought by whoever could pay them, be he a bandit or maybe a fractious servant of the state. In an era of poor communications, local ties were usually stronger than loyalty to some far-off government in Istanbul, and the population's experience of the demands of central government for taxes and manpower was hardly more favorable than at the hands of so-called rebels with whom they lived. It was primarily in Anatolia that troops were raised from the peasantry, and it was Anatolia then that suffered the most violent effects of the ensuing brigandage and outright rebellion. And honestly, things weren't even any better for the cavalry, because as soon as cavalry realized they weren't going to be paid any longer because they weren't needed for modern styles of warfare, they too became outlaws and only added to the problems that were already exacerbated throughout Anatolia. And it wasn't just financial issues that plagued the Ottomans at the start of the 17th century. Huge chunks of the empire went into complete rebellion. The Kurds declared their independence in northern Syria, just as the Ottomans were engaged with the Safavids and Habsburgs. In 1606, the governor of Aleppo rose in rebellion, as did parts of Anatolia. Aleppo and Anatolia were quickly brought to heel, and the rebellious governor put to death in 1610. But modern Lebanon then rebelled in 1610, though again this rebellion was quickly crushed. And there were lesser revolts as well. Egypt was constantly a problem for the Ottomans throughout the 17th century. Tripoli and Tunis both revolted several times in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. To a large extent, increasingly, the Ottomans dealt with these incessant rebellions by co-opting their leaders into the regime. Rebel leaders either now found themselves defeated and executed, or increasingly just made a new local official in their home region. This was an effective and cheap way of ending a rebellion, but it did diffuse the Sultan's power. The Cossacks along the Black Sea coast, and a group we're going to talk about more in coming episodes, were yet another of the Ottomans' steadily growing problems. With the appearance of the Ottomans on the northern Black Sea coast in the later 15th century, and the ensuing connection between this and the Crimean Turks, the politics of the steppe were effectively transformed, forcing Polish and Ukrainian nobles of the borderlands with the empire to recruit Cossack warriors to defend their new territories against Tartar raids. Soon after 1538, when Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent led a successful campaign against Moldavia, he designated the northern Black Sea coast from the Dniester River to the Bo a new province. But there were subsequent Cossack attacks on strongholds and on herdsmen and travelers, which caused the Ottomans mounting concern, as thousands of captives, as well as livestock, arms, and all sorts of other goods were seized in the region, where the Sultan had tried to bring some sort of security, really without effect. In 1603, the Ottomans began yet another war, and this time again with the Shah of Iran. It wasn't a smart move. The Ottoman state was already stretched to the limit, and yet the Sultan, Ahmed II by then, made the decision to go to war regardless. In May of 1605, the two armies met near Tabriz in present-day Iran. The result was a disaster for the Ottomans, whose army quit the field, leaving behind their equipment and provisions. Steadily, the Iranians pushed the Ottomans out of their Caucasus and in the strongholds that they held. In 1611, the two sides reached a deal whereby the border between the two kingdoms would revert back to that of 1555, which was a massive win for Iran. These years and the ones that followed them were honestly, truly, a time of troubles for the Ottoman Empire. The work of contemporary men who were writing letters back and forth reflected the anxiety of the empire and the crisis that everyone observed. One author who was writing at the turn of the millennium named 4 main Islamic states then in existence: the regional empires of the Ottomans, Safavids, Mughals in India, and Uzbeks, all of which had been forged since the Mongol invasions of the 13th century and had Turkish and steppe nomadic roots. He noted that, unlike the Mughals, who claimed descent from the Timurids, and the Uzbeks, who claimed direct descent from Genghis Khan, the Ottomans lacked a claim to legitimacy based on descent, nor did they have a religious ideology that could be traced back to the Prophet, as of course the Safavids in Iran did. He observed their earlier claims to legitimacy based on ideologies of their descent from the Uzgud claim of Central Asia, or, perhaps, as the inheritors of the former empire of the Seljuk Turks, or, frankly, as the only true warriors for Islam. All of these bases of legitimacy, he wrote, were irrelevant. What had given the Ottomans their unquestioned legitimacy was first and foremost a tangible dynastic order committed to universal justice dispensed by a strong central authority. This, however, the author claimed, had dissipated since the time of Selim II, or perhaps even earlier, when Suleiman allowed his favorites a hand in the affairs of state. As well as producing pessimistic analysis, the Islamic millennium engendered a yearning for a well-ordered world, which the Ottoman intellectuals imagined had existed in the past, but was gone in the present. Territorial victories were now just less easy to win, and the Sultan had retired from active involvement in the business of the government. The vicious struggle for a share in the spoils accruing to those in power was profoundly shocking to men who had been raised under the old order when the Sultan was in ultimate command. The Ottoman Empire, of course, was not alone in this. Government by favorites had become kind of the order of the day, particularly in Spain and France, after the turn of the millennium. In fact, one author in Europe wrote criticizing Philip II's son, that he, quote, should not be content with simply having supreme power, and then merely sleeping and relaxing, but should be the first in government, in council, and in the offices of the state, end quote. So the Ottoman state wasn't alone in this. But the biggest issue that remained was the changing nature of the Sultanate, because this was the biggest change. European kings really had stopped being conquerors for some time now. But the changing nature of the Ottoman Sultanate was something that was definitely new. Sultans were no longer warriors. Now, to an extent, the reasons for this change were practical. Wars were now fought hundreds of miles from Istanbul, and because warfare was now almost exclusively siege-driven, these wars lasted longer. Hence, if the Sultan went on campaign, he might be gone for years, which just wasn't feasible to keep the government in Istanbul functioning. Another change was the increasing connections between religious and political authority. Under Suleiman and those before him, religious authorities had by and large stayed above and away from the political fray. Now, they were increasingly engaging with political authorities and sometimes replacing them, issuing state policy themselves. This change is going to lead the Ottoman state to turn away from some of the advances of Western science, much, as we will see, to its detriment. As the new millennium and new century unfolded, there were hints that the state religion of the Ottomans was becoming puritanical, even dogmatic. There were new laws restricting the apparel of Christians and Jews, the drinking of alcohol banned completely, briefly, albeit. Yet although it became increasingly intolerant of latitudes within the practice of Islam, and was prepared to pursue those who went beyond the bounds of acceptability in the expression of Muslim faith, the Ottoman Empire still remained remarkably tolerant of non-Muslim minorities, whose separate and unequal, of course, status was guaranteed by law in exchange for the payment of the poll tax, as it had been for centuries. Jews remained prominent in commerce, and many were successful tax farmers. During much of the 16th century, they were close to the Ottoman dynasty, employed as physicians to the sultans and as diplomats. However, as the 16th century and 17th century especially wore on, Jews began to lose a lot of their legal protections, and as a result, saw their status decline throughout the empire. Likewise, between 1580 and 1610, Orthodox Christians lost many of the legal protections they had previously enjoyed. Many Greek Orthodox churches, by example, were converted to mosques during this period. Now, while this episode might make it seem like all was lost for the Ottomans, remember, you would have said the same for the Romans during the crisis of the 3rd century. The Romans recovered, as we know, and to an extent, so would the Ottomans, as we will see in a future episode. But for the moment, we're going to wheel back west and return to England and its Virgin Queen.